I always turn to the water, like, and look at, well, how is the water doing? And very often that's going to mirror the health, surprise, surprise, the health of our communities, the health of our society at large.
Hey folks, welcome to the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast. This episode is with a guest who is one of the few guests who actually inspired the core idea for this podcast. Dr. Easkey Britton is an Irish scientist, surfer, and writer who specializes in blue health and our relationship with water. She is the author of two amazing books, Saltwater and the Blood and Ebb and Flow, the latter of which was my introduction to Easkey and her work, and also how I got to meet her earlier this year at an event at the Finisterre store in London. In addition to her research on the connection between oceans and human health, Easkey is the co-founder of Wavemaker Collective, a social impact leadership retreat, and has worked on several projects to support women in surfing. Plus, her big wave surfing exploits have been featured in many films, including Waveriders. In this episode, we focus on that relationship with water, from how the oceans leave a fingerprint on us to kinesthetic empathy and how we can shift from an egocentric point of view to an ecocentric one. We end with a couple of practices to help you create or deepen your relationship with water. Many thanks to Easkey for taking time to chat. She's a true hero of mine, and if you haven't heard of her work before, I am sure you'll leave this episode feeling the same way. Make sure to pick up a copy of Easkey's book, Ebb and Flow. We've got a link to it in the book recommendations at ecosystemmember.com. Without further delay, here's the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast with surfer, scientist, and writer, Easkey Britton. So today on the Ecosystem Member Podcast, we have Dr. Easkey Britton, author of the book Saltwater and the Blood, Ebb and Flow, a surfer and a scientist. Thank you so much for joining us, Easkey.
Hey, thanks, Rick. Delighted to be here.
For those who haven't read your books that I just mentioned, or seen your surf videos, or even seen your research cited in major media outlets, what is your relationship with nature?
Well, you might guess that it starts with the ocean. It really infuses every part of who I am. It's where I find my sense of identity. It's totally shaped my sense of identity and this feeling of that I'm so grateful for, this feeling of belonging and connection I have in the world. And it comes from, I suppose, before birth, thanks to my parents who are among the pioneering surfers in Ireland in the 60s and 70s. I came along in the late 80s, and then my sister, but we were born into this, quite unusually for Ireland at the time, this surfing way of life that was actually inadvertently kickstarted by my grandmother, Mary Britton, who owned a hotel by the beach here in Rasnala at the time. Surfing kind of modern surfing heyday in California, not in Ireland, in the 60s, but she was promoting tourism in Ireland with our tourist board Fáilte, and saw Malibu breaking, and it was the time of the Beach Boys, and got influenced by all of that. And she somehow managed to get some of the very first surfboards back into the country, which would be a grand tale in itself. And she had 5 boys who, I guess, when they saw these things arrive, including my dad, who was 12 at the time. And I know that I just grew up with these stories of how they were trying to figure out what to do with them, lying down on them for the first year until they saw a surfer standing up. And so it was that kind of initiation into the ocean through surfing was the vehicle in my family and growing up. And then it's just become this lifelong relationship where it's offered so much to me in terms of it being a playground during my childhood years of like discovery, curiosity, exploration that then fueled me to want to travel, and using surfing to do that as a professional surfer through my late teens, early 20s. And then it became very much about a place of testing those, the limits of our kind of human potential when it came to big wave surfing, for me anyways, throughout my 20s, with the advent again of pioneering something like big wave surfing in Ireland, which hadn't happened until around 2010. All the way through it, though, the common thread has always been, how do we understand that innate pull water in the ocean and these places seem to have on us? What is it? Why are we drawn as humans to water in particular? And why does the ocean make me feel how it makes me feel? And why does it end up being so like addictive, really, that you just can't get enough of it once you get once you have that first early positive connection? And so then began to track and search for these stories of ocean connection around the world. which has led me to where I am now with being the author of these books, very much exploring this emerging field of blue health. So looking at that interconnectedness, interrelationship between our human health and well-being and the health of the planet itself, but in particular from the perspective of the ocean.
And so you could say you're part of sort of Ireland's first family of surfing. And I read somewhere that you're named after a wave. So feels like it was kind of pulling you in this direction. And I'm not sure it seems like you had much of another choice to not be so connected to the ocean. Is that true? Are you actually named after a wave?
Yes, that's very true. I write about that in Saltwater in the Blood, the kind of power of a naming. But yeah, it comes from it comes from the name for a surf break in the west coast of Ireland. It's also comes from the Irish word for fish, Eask, and it's all tied up with the whole kind of mythology of place as well, which is still really rich in Ireland. It's named after an important salmon river that comes out and then gives shape to where the wave breaks. So that lovely, again, story of interconnectedness.
Very cool. So you mentioned blue health. You talked about our connection to the ocean. How would you characterize sort of humanity's relationship with nature and the ocean and how that intersects with our health and your field of research in blue health?
Well, I think for me, I mean, it's reflected, I suppose, in all ecosystems and environments, but it seems to be especially potent and powerful that water really holds the memory of who we are, like it because of the nature of water, it being such a unique kind of substance. It literally does take all of who we are and carries that for better or for worse. So really all our kind of sort of human action, story, history is still held in the water, and the water has been here since the beginning of time, and it's continually cycling through us, through all life, through all time. So it really is, the story of life itself, and of our lives too, and of our ancestry. And I think it's a really dynamic relationship. It's always in flux, but I really think to get a kind of pulse on the health of society, how we're doing within our communities, for example, I always turn to the water, and look at, well, how is the water doing? And very often that's going to mirror the health, surprise, surprise, the health of our communities, the health of our society at large. And then when it comes to humanity as a whole, I mean, you kind of have to sort of at least split it and look at it as I do in my book, Ebb and Flow, of modern society, and those of us who live within that sphere. And then also how much that can be learned then from others who've never lost the connection with water, especially in Indigenous communities the world over. And there's still traces of that connection to the water as something sacred rather than as a commodity. There's still fragments, I would argue, of that left lingering even in modern society, even though we've tried so hard to kind of tame and control and manage it, manage it very badly.
And so when we look at our watersheds, essentially like the water on Earth is the water on Earth. And I think in your book, you talk about, we're swimming in the same waters that prehistoric creatures might have swam in. We're all connected through water. How do you think we've sort of lost this idea? Because it's actually really based in science that the water we have is this connection point through time. Why do you think we've lost sight of that?
I guess many reasons. It stems from that story of separation that's become this dominant narrative that shapes so much of modern society. And you see that, okay, the water is one aspect, but I like to look at water as well because it runs through and connects all ecosystems too. And so it's also a mirror of nature as a whole, of how it's doing, because it's water is what gives all those places, all of nature, its life force, I would argue. For me, that's what it comes from. I mean, there's so many reasons for that, but it's also, I guess, when I look at it in the sort of the history of the planet and our human history, it's happened so recently, and it's happened, I suppose, with the advent of first that shift into agriculture and then into more industrialization, especially in the last couple of centuries. But it's really only, I think, we're talking even just in a matter of 3 generations or less of that real, especially when it comes to water, of that wanting to really just turning it into a resource and a commodity, and really denigrating water in terms of like its associations with the feminine and the sacred. Those two go hand in hand as well. And we really see that separation happening there too, of anything to do with the feminine or sacred was really kind of almost to the point of vilified and completely oppressed and, I suppose, destroyed in many ways.
So you write in Ebb and Flow, the dominant narrative when it came to blue health still emphasized what water can do for you, nature for us, rather than part of nature. How important is reciprocity when you think about nature and the water and our oceans?
It's crucial. It comes from, I guess, that having that appreciation and gratitude, but more so than that, even recognizing that there's this interaction, this exchange happening. And of course, the science now is evidencing just that more and more of the aliveness of the ocean itself, of rivers, of water, and then of the soil and of the trees. And so we're not just going about having our isolated experiences. We ourselves are, we're immersed in this very more than human world. Writing Ebb and Flow, I had these amazing conversations with other people who were really causing this perspective shift when it came to understanding that relationship. And reciprocity is this theme that comes up again and again. And of course, in Robin Wall Kimmerer's work, who I know you're a fan of as well, and I'm greatly inspired by. But this idea that we ourselves, in terms of our human bodies, we're also more than human, and who we are extends beyond the limits of what we see as our kind of physical selves, and even our biological selves. And it's also being shaped by the water that we're drinking, that's moving through us, by the water that we immerse ourselves in. I think a fantastic example to speak to this would be Dr. Cliff Capono's work, a Hawaiian surfer scientist, and his amazing PhD work on the Surfer Biome Project, which basically is evidencing, again, what the indigenous knowledge has always held, but how when we go into the ocean, it leaves its fingerprint on us, to kind of quote from himself, so that it's our very microbiome that makes up over 50% of who we are is altered by the ocean, is actually more similar or akin to the microbiome of marine mammals than other humans that we hang out with on land that don't go into the sea, for example. And the same, I imagine, is true, for people who really are like working with the soil or immersed in forests or mountains. It's not a metaphor. This is very literal, biological. We are, constantly changing in response to our environments, but we're also, very much part of these places, a part of nature.
So you're a surfer and a scientist and a researcher and a writer, and Cliff Capono is also a surfer and a scientist. And even Yvon Chouinard, the founder of Patagonia, talks a lot about how surfers have this special connection with nature and specifically the ocean. Maybe it is just being kind of vulnerable out in the seas and in the waves and seeing what it can do, especially your experience as a big wave surfer. Why do you think surfers have this sort of leading edge idea of a need to protect, but also connect with oceans and the water?
Yeah, I think it just comes from maybe the fact that a few reasons, like you just alluded to some of them there as well, and the fact that I feel like if I look at my own relationship, because it's lifelong, all of what I've done has stemmed from that early childhood experiences that really fueled my curiosity and that kind of creative thinking. And we now know from research within blue health too how much water actually fosters that creative thinking, essentially. And you see it in writing, some of the great nature writers, Henry Thoreau, and why he hung out by the pond, and Walden, and there's so many other examples. Going back to, I guess, the immersive quality of water and it being so multi-sensory, but also it brings to life that sense of entanglement, let's say, that we are, and the realness of being a part of nature in a very visceral way. You wipe out and you just get like seawater injected into every orifice, and you do come out and you feel like you're definitely part ocean. But then it just really brings it home. You're keenly aware, and you are immediately affected by the health of that water body as well. And increasingly, a lot of the water bodies we immerse ourselves in here in Ireland and the UK are becoming more and more polluted. So there's this kind of almost reversal of a lot of the ground that was maybe made in kind of cleaning up our water with the advent of like these Clean Water Acts and so on. But it's almost like the tragedy is playing out now, where as we're beginning to realize, oh, this is really good for me to have these moments of connection with water and the rise of like sea swimming and open water swimming, surfing, of course, especially post-pandemic, and that pull nature and water seem to have on us. They're also becoming increasingly polluted, and so there's that tension that happens. But you can't, I suppose, when you have that kind of close interaction with something like the ocean in that way, you can't really ignore it. It becomes very, very visible, very real.
I got my copy of Ebb and Flow signed at the event you did at the Finisterre store in London, and during the Q&A, I probably sounded like a crazy person because it was during the weeks where sort of the big issue in the UK was water and river pollution, and I was definitely feeling distressed at my own connection with the water, and just seeing it polluted felt almost like it was polluting me. And maybe that has to do something with the entanglement of just being caught in polluted water when you're surfing or swimming. For those of us that have a connection, how do we bring that connection to bear in an effective way when we think about either helping to promote changing the laws, or even just getting other people more connected with the water so that they take action on behalf of it? How do we use that connection to create change?
I think it goes back to when we say connection, it's really about relationship and the quality of our relationships that we have and our way of relating with the world around us. And it comes back to me to look at it at a personal level or individual level. It's like those everyday kind of interactions that we have, everyday way of relating to nature around us, of checking in with actually, well, what is the quality of that? What's that like really starting there? And because then it does ripple out. And I think we tend to get caught up because it can be so overwhelming, the scale of the problem, right? And it seems too big, but it's actually kind of going back to checking in with actually, this is what I do when I start to, my nervous system gets way too jacked up and I totally despair. Is going back and just checking, well, actually, how is the water in my body doing, and moving my body, because I know that like helps the water, energize me more. And then thinking about where my water comes from, and then actually going to my nearest body of water and spending time with tuning into it. So creating that kind of finding ways in our everyday to create those spaces where we're actually deepening our connection through just listening, through just showing up and being present, even bearing witness to water in whatever state it's in, and just actually allowing that feeling in as well of whatever it is, of joy, but maybe it's also grief, and not shutting that down. So I think that really helps us then to remain open and shift into a different mindset and also a way of being that maybe allows then for, again, a deeper way of relating, rather than trying to jump into like fix it mode, which tends to be, I suppose it's a more masculine kind of approach, but it sort of leapfrogs again that deeper connection or reciprocity, and into ways we're still stuck in that sort of human framing of, okay, how can we fix this problem from our point of view? Rather than the water's point of view, or the forest point of view, or the otter's point of view, if you get my meaning. So it's more about finding ways just to bring it into our everyday, those little moments of connection, and from there they're going to continue to grow.
And I think you kind of touched on it there, this idea that you mentioned in the book, kinesthetic empathy. And, I think it's all about empathy with nature. And sometimes I feel like we even have a hard time having empathy with other humans. So how do we develop that empathy with the oceans, with the water, with the river, when sometimes it's even challenging to relate and have empathy for our fellow man and woman?
It's really hard because we live in a society that's really taught us how not to feel by disconnecting us from our bodies in so many ways. And that is bubbling up now. And we're seeing it in this kind of like time of, I would argue, collective trauma that we're going through. And I also write about that in the book as well. And yet I find also great hope and excitement in the fact that our healing also comes through our relationship and connection with water. And I even coming across those stories of how maybe, water, because it leaves such a powerful imprint on our bodies, the memory we've had with water, be that positive or negative. And often there can be really, traumatic experiences associated with water. It is a real place of risk and danger and loss. But that even in those moments, those scenarios of a community or someone who's experienced, the disaster of a flood, or the fear and terror of having to cross the Mediterranean to seek asylum, or the impact of a tsunami, And then discovering these stories of how there are these initiatives and organizations now that are creating these sort of spaces to tap into this empathy in a more deeper way, but how water then can actually act as such a healer in those situations. It can be so transformative. So there's so many powerful examples of transforming that dominant narrative of, say, the ocean as a place of fear and risk and danger, or nature even, into a space that's transformative, healing and empowering even. But that only happens, I think, when communities come together of people to kind of share in the connection, and to creating the safe space is kind of crucial, so that we feel that we belong, so that we feel that we're not an outsider. And that's another big thing, I suppose, in that whole area of blue health and relating to nature. It's such a complex relationship. And then beaches, seas and coasts, and surfing in particular, can often seem really exclusive to so many people.
And so one of my favorite things from Ebb and Flow is sort of the practices that you have at the end of each section in the book. So maybe to end the podcast with the final question, do you have a practice or an exercise that you would recommend that listeners can sort of do right now, or in a couple of hours when they have a little bit of time, so that they can, start to generate, if they don't have that connection, or sort of renew that connection that they have with the water? Is there one particular exercise that you'd recommend them giving a shot?
Yeah, thanks for that. There's lots in the book that are, I suppose, they're more like invitations, and they're embodied practices. So how to actually, so instead of staying with the theoretical of creating connection, like, well, how do you actually do that in practice? So I thought that it was really important to include that aspect in the book. So it's everything from taking moments to reflect and journal, to ask these more inquiring questions about your own relationship with water, to then different like movement practices to start to sense and feel water in different ways, and then even visualizations. And so perhaps now, I mean, it's lovely too, because I've put that out there, but I've received so many examples of other ways people are doing it. So one beautiful one was shared with me by Rosalind, actually at one of the Finisterre events as well, who'd read the book, and she started to journal. I thought I love this as a daily practice of the moments of connection with water. So where and when water shows up in her day. So it could be like the rain, but noticing maybe just even the patterns of the raindrops on the window, or how they fall in a puddle, like tiniest, almost insignificant detail that we might not notice, or that we pass by, or that feeling we get when we actually are consciously take a moment in the shower, even to notice how the water feels on our body, or that sip of water from that's in our tea or coffee. So those could be little ways of just actually keeping like a daily journal of water, what you notice about it at the end of every day, of how it showed up for you, which I think is a lovely way of fostering the reciprocity. And then my go-to as well, because it's the first step always, is for me to return to my breath, is the way I stay connected to my body, and then to everything else and everyone else around me. So maybe the step one of how do you create that empathy is to return to yourself, and that's through the breath. So just even taking time to take 3 conscious breaths and really extending the exhale. And of course, then doing that, you're connecting with the ocean, because so much of our oxygen, I think over 50% of the planet's oxygen comes from the ocean. So that's a lovely way to connect, I think, through that ocean breath.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your amazing books and your work. And thank you so much for taking time to chat today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rick.